Marguerite Sinclair, Willow Bend Valley, skeptical blind beekeeper. Nobody in Willow Bend believed a woman who couldn't see could save an orchard. They believed it even less when she was the only one who did. Marguerite Sinclair lost her sight when she was 43. A car accident, a long recovery, and a life she had to rebuild from nothing. Everyone thought that meant giving up the bees. She didn't. If you love stories about people the world underestimated and got it completely wrong, you're in the right place. And if you're new here, hit subscribe, because Forgotten Farm Tales brings you a story like this every single week. Marguerite had kept bees since she was 19 years old. Back then, her father taught her everything, out behind the old barn, using nothing but a smoker, a hive tool, and a lot of patience. She used to joke that bees taught her more about people than people ever did. After the accident, her son Daniel begged her to sell the hives, said it wasn't safe anymore, said a woman who couldn't see the world in front of her had no business working with thousands of stinging insects. She told him the bees never needed her eyes, they needed her patience, so she stayed. The first year was hard. She stumbled through the rows more than once. She got stung more times than she could count. But slowly, something shifted. She learned to read her hives through sound and touch, the way some people read a book. A healthy hive hums low and steady. A stressed hive sounds sharp, uneven, almost nervous. She could tell the difference in seconds, long before anyone with perfect vision even noticed something was wrong. The town of Willow Bend didn't understand any of that. They just saw a blind widow alone on 40 acres doing something they thought was reckless. For years, they mostly left her alone. A little pity, a little gossip, nothing more, until the year everything went wrong. That spring, a mysterious blight moved through the valley's orchards. Not insects, not weather, something quieter and far more dangerous. Something in the soil, something in the water, nobody could say for certain. Whatever it was killing bee colonies one farm at a time. The Delacroix family lost 60 hives in a single week. The Whitmores lost almost their entire apple orchard's pollination overnight. Panic spread through Willow Bend like wildfire. Because in a valley like this, bees weren't a hobby, they were survival. Without bees, the harvest would fail. And without the harvest, half the town would lose their income for the entire year. At an emergency town meeting, the county agricultural agent stood at the front of the room and admitted something nobody wanted to hear. Nobody had answers. Not the experts, not the scientists they'd flown in from the state university. Farmers argued over what to try next. Someone suggested new pesticide treatments. Someone else suggested importing bees from out of state at a cost most of them couldn't afford. Voices rose, tempers grew short. Weeks of lost income had a way of doing that to good people. Marguerite sat quietly in the back, listening the way she always listened. When she finally spoke, the room went cold. She said her hives hadn't been touched. Not one had weakened. A man near the front laughed under his breath. Maybe you just can't tell the difference. A few people chuckled along with him. Nobody corrected him. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Come listen for yourself." 2 days later, a small, reluctant group drove out to her land, mostly out of desperation, not belief. What they heard stopped them at the fence line. Her hives were humming, steady and strong, the exact sound healthy bees are supposed to make. Nothing like the eerie silence spreading across the rest of the valley. Nobody could explain why hers were untouched, including her. At first, she assumed it was luck, but luck didn't explain a pattern this consistent. So she started paying closer attention, walking her property, slowly, deliberately, listening to every corner of it, the way she'd learned to listen to everything since the accident. That's when she noticed something the others had completely missed. Her water source was different. She used an old spring-fed well on the north side of the property, untouched for decades, the same well her father had used. Everyone else drew from the valley's shared irrigation system, the one upgraded 2 years earlier with new agricultural runoff piping. It was a small detail, almost nothing. But almost nothing was exactly the kind of thing Marguerite had learned to notice. She brought her theory to the agricultural agent. He was skeptical at first, the way most people were skeptical of her. But with no other leads and an entire season on the line, he finally agreed to test the water. The wait for results felt endless. 5 days later, the answer came back, and it changed everything. Contamination, trace chemical runoff, leaking slowly into the valley's shared irrigation system for months, invisible to everyone until it was almost too late. A cracked seal on an old junction pipe, small enough to miss during any routine inspection, had been leaking for longer than anyone realized. It hadn't touched Marguerite's bees, because her well had never been connected to it. The agricultural agent later admitted his team had walked past that exact section of pipe twice during 2 separate inspections and never once suspected it. It took someone who couldn't see the pipeline at all to find what everyone else had looked directly at and missed. The blind woman everyone doubted had just solved what the experts couldn't. Word spread through Willow Bend fast. The same people who'd laughed at the meeting were now showing up at her gate, asking questions, asking for help. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply told them what needed to happen next. But not everyone believed her the second time either. One grower, a man named Russell Pratt, refused to change his irrigation setup. He said switching systems mid-season would cost him more than the contamination ever did. Marguerite tried to explain what she'd learned, patiently, the way she explained everything. Russell wasn't interested. "I've been farming longer than you've been blind," he told her, right there in front of half the town. The room went silent. Even Grant, the man who'd laughed at her first, looked uncomfortable. Marguerite didn't respond to the insult. She simply said his bees would keep struggling as long as that water kept flowing through his hives. He ignored her. 3 weeks later, his colonies collapsed completely. Every hive on his property gone. He showed up at her gate the following morning, hat in hand, saying nothing at first. She didn't gloat. She never once brought up what he'd said. She just handed him a jar of honey from her own hives and told him where to start. That was the moment something shifted in Willow Bend. Not just belief in her methods, but respect for how she carried herself, even when people didn't deserve it. Over the following weeks, the county worked to repair the compromised pipeline. It wasn't a quick fix. Every household on that system had to change how they irrigated in the meantime. Marguerite helped surviving colonies recover, sharing her own healthy hives to help rebuild what the valley had lost. She spent long days walking from farm to farm, guided by her cane and by memory, teaching other beekeepers what to listen for. It wasn't instant. Recovery never is. There were setbacks along the way. A late frost threatened 2 of the newly rebuilt colonies. A shipment of replacement queen bees arrived weaker than expected. Each time, Marguerite adjusted, calmly, without panic. She'd learned long ago that farming rewarded patience far more than it rewarded certainty. Some nights, She sat outside long after everyone else had gone home, just listening to the hives settle into the dark. She could hear which ones were still struggling. She could hear which ones were finally finding their rhythm again. Slowly, the humming came back. Orchard by orchard, the valley came back to life. By the time the harvest arrived, Willow Bend had one of its strongest seasons in years. Apple trees hung heavy with fruit. Almond blossoms filled the air with a sweetness that hadn't been there in months, and every grower in the valley knew exactly why. Marguerite's son, Daniel, visited that fall. He'd flown in the moment he heard the story from a neighbor, still half in disbelief. He found her exactly where she always was, standing among her hives, listening. "You could have told everyone you were right," he said. "You didn't have to be quiet about it." She smiled and shook her head. "I wasn't trying to be right," she said. "I was just trying to pay attention." Daniel stood there a long moment, watching his mother work a hive with steady, practiced hands, no hesitation at all. For the first time since the accident, he understood. Her blindness had never been the obstacle everyone assumed it was. If anything, it had sharpened everything else. Her hearing, her patience, her ability to notice what everyone else rushed past. He thought about all the years he'd spent worrying about her, urging her to slow down, to give up the land, to live a smaller, safer life. Watching her now, steady and sure among 1,000 bees, he realized he'd had it backwards the entire time. She hadn't needed protecting. She'd needed people to trust what she already knew. These days, people in Willow Bend don't whisper about the blind beekeeper anymore. They ask her to teach them how to listen the way she does. Young beekeepers drive in from neighboring counties just to spend an afternoon walking her rows, learning to hear the difference between a hive at peace and a hive in trouble. She teaches them the same way her father taught her, slowly, without shortcuts. No lectures, no diagrams, just hours spent standing quietly beside the hives, learning to notice. Some of them struggle at first, the way she once did. They want to rely on their eyes, on quick glances instead of real attention. She tells them the same thing every time. The eyes miss things. Attention doesn't. A few of them go on to start their own apiaries nearby, using her methods, carrying her lessons into new corners of the valley. Willow Bend has changed because of it. Slower irrigation checks, more careful chemical use. A whole community that learned the hard way to pay closer attention to the land they depend on. The same man who laughed at her in that meeting now sends his grandson out to her farm every summer to learn everything she knows. Even Russell Pratt stops by now, and then, usually with a bag of feed or a new hive box he built himself, still a little quiet about the whole thing. Marguerite never brings up that meeting. She doesn't need to, because in the end, it wasn't her eyes that saved the harvest. It was everything she'd learned to notice instead. And maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Sometimes the people we're quickest to underestimate are the ones paying the closest attention. Willow Bend learned that lesson the hard way, one silent hive at a time, and they're not likely to forget it anytime soon. If this story moved you, you'll love what's coming next on Forgotten Farm Tales. Subscribe now and stay a while longer.